All right, guys, so welcome back to our Cisco lab. Now we're going to get started with our configuring OSPF version 3 activity. Now this activity's main function is to teach us how to configure OSPF version 3 in an IPv6 network. So we have a network, 3 routers, 3 switches, the same network that we had for configuring OSPF version 2. Except that now all the devices, they have been configured with IPv6 addresses instead of IPv4 addresses. And the same thing goes here. We basically need to use OSPF version 3 to teach every single one of the routers about all the networks that are not directly connected to them. Now, just as we did in the OSPF version 2 exercise, I'm going to get started by going into router 1 and showing the routing table in router 1. Now, does anyone know what is the command to show the routing table in R1? Remember that now we're talking about IPv6 addresses. So I'm interested in the IPv6 version of the routing table. Does anyone know the command to verify the routing table for IPv6?
So IPv6 route?
Yep, show IPv6 route will do the job. And we'll see that all the networks that our router 1 knows about, they are all directly connected routes. Okay, it knows about the 2001 DB8 Cafe 1. It's here in the table. It knows about the Cafe A001. It's here in the table. It knows about the Cafe A003. It's here in the table. And these are all in the table because they're directly connected networks. We don't need to do much about it. It's already there. Okay. Now, the first thing that we need to make sure we do when configuring OSPF version 3 is that we need to make sure that all the routers have IPv6 unicast routing. We need to make sure all routers, they have IPv6 enabled. And how do we do that? So the first thing, we need to check if IPv6 unicast routing is enabled. And in order to check that, I'm going to show running configuration in router 1. And we'll be able to see that there's pretty much no entry for the IPv6 unicast routing anywhere. So we're actually going to have to activate IPv6 routing before we actually start configuring OSPF version 3. Does anyone remember how to configure IPv6 in a router? How to enable it? Introduction to networks, guys.
IPv6 unicast routing?
Unicast routing.
Yes. So let's go IPv6. And that's it. So it looks like nothing happened. So let's do one thing. Let's show the IPv6 routing table again. Yeah, it's still the same. But we need to activate IPv6 anyways on a router. Even if the routing table already had the IPv6 routes, we still need to type it in this command. So one of the reasons why OSPF version 3 doesn't work a lot of the time is that actually people forget that they need to activate IPv6 routing. Okay. And the command for that is IPv6 unicast routing. Now that we have IPv6 unicast routing activated, what do we do next? We need to initiate the OSPF process, right? It says here. So the first step is already done, enabling IPv6 routing. The second one is creating an OSPF process ID number 10. And we are going to use this OSPF process ID number 10 to advertise the IPv6 networks. All right, so does anyone remember how to do that? So we
IPv6 router, OSPF, and process ID.
Yep. So why not just the router? Because these router, it's only for IPv6 networks. Okay, so if we use just the command router, this is only about IPv4 networks. Because we need IPv6 networks, we need to type it in IPv6 router. Because now we are telling the router that the protocol should use IPv6 addresses. And what are the options we have? EIGRP, OSPF, and RIP. Now, please note that in Packet Tracer, we don't have BGP for IPv6 router because Packet Tracer is very limited. Okay, but in real life, we can actually share IPv6 routes using BGP as well. Okay, just that Packet Tracer is simplified. All right, so IPv6 router, we're configuring OSPF, so it has to be OSPF here. And the process ID again is 10. And that's all we need to do. Now, we're going to get a warning message, OSPF V3 notification message. It actually says OSPF V3 process 10 could not pick up a router ID. Please configure it manually. OSPF V3 has the same router ID as OSPF version 2. So it looks like an IPv4 address. So it's the same thing happens here. If we don't configure the router ID, the router is going to choose the highest IP of the loopback. But we don't have any IPv4 loopback. Okay, so how about the IPv4 addresses of all the active interfaces? We don't have any IPv4 address at all in the router. And that is why we have to set up manually. Otherwise, OSPF version 3 is not going to initialize. Is that clear? So how do we do that? With the command router ID. Again, the router ID should be the same here. All ones for router 1. And we are done. All right, so we have initialized OSPF version 3. We have assigned a router ID. We made sure that the router has IPv6 routing enabled. And now it's just a matter of enabling OSPF on each interface. Now, I use the question mark inside the IPv6 router OSPF to show you one thing. There is no network command. It doesn't exist. There is no network command. Oh my God, so how do we do it then? Now for OSPF version 3, it's slightly different. We need to activate OSPF v3 on the interface. So imagine if there was a network command in OSPF v3, you had to type all the time the entire network. OSPF IPv6 addresses, they're too big. It would be inconvenient. So what they did instead was that they allow you to activate OSPF v3 on the interface itself. And then that interface IP address is going to be advertised. So how do we do that, teacher? We go to the interfaces. I'm going to exit and I'm going to go to the interfaces that I want to activate OSPF version 3. I'm going to show IPv6 interface brief before I do that, because I want to know which interfaces I want to advertise. So I need to advertise the 00, the 00, serial, and the serial 001. So what do? We go to the interface. Let's do the 00 first. And now we need to assign this interface to OSPF version 3. And how do we do that? With the command IPv6 OSPF, because we want to assign it to an OSPF v3 routing protocol. After that, we need to specify the process. So we are assigning this interface to the OSPF process that we just created. And the process that we just created was process 10. So I specify process 10 here. In OSPF v3, we also need to specify the area. That is the next thing we need to specify. We already talked about this. If we only have single area OSPF, everybody belongs to area OSPF. Everybody belongs to area 0, no questions asked. That's what we are going to do here. Done. Okay. In the same way, we have to do the same for the other two interfaces. The 000, IPv6 OSPF 10 area 0, and interface 001, IPv6 OSPF 10 area 0. Pretty much done. We have already configured all these networks to be advertised into OSPF version 3. Now, how do I check that? How do you check that to make sure you're advertising the networks? Do you guys remember the command show IP protocols? We do show IPv6 protocols, and let's see what happens when we type it in that. These are the interfaces that we are currently advertising the network of. So all the networks that belong to gig 00, serial 000, and 001, we are currently advertising into OSPF V3 process ID 10. And they all belong to area 0. Now, if we show the neighbors, and if we issue the command do show IPv6 OSPF neighbors, we currently have nothing because we have to configure the other two routers. The same way that I did before, I'm going to do it right now. I'm going to pause the recording. So if you're watching this recording, pause the recording and take a few minutes to do router 2 and router 3 as well, and form the adjacency and then verify if the OSPF V3 networks, they have been learned into R1. All right, so be back in 5 minutes. And for those that are watching the lecture recording, please pause the video right now. Okay, guys, so we're back. Let's finish the activity. Let's move on to router 2. And let's configure OSPF version 3. Once again, the first step in configuring OSPF version 3 is making sure IPv6 routing is enabled with the command IPv6 unicast routing. Done. Now the next step is to configure OSPF version 3. So we create the process ID with the command IPv6 router OSPF, and we specify a process ID, which is 10. Now we get a warning again saying that the process ID could not pick a router ID. That is because we have no IPv4 interfaces configured. So we have to choose and pick a router ID and configure it manually. For router 2 is going to be the all 2s. After that, we just have to specify the area, which is area 0. Oops, no, sorry. The area is in the interface itself. So router ID, all 2s, and that's all. Right. Now, what's the next step? We don't have the network command in OSPF version 3. Remember that, please. We just need to go to the interface and activate OSPF version 3 in the interface. So what are the interfaces? I'm going to check which interfaces we need to do. Do show IPv6 interface brief. So we need to advertise the gig 00, both serials 000 and 001. So let's go ahead and interface gig 00, IPv6. What else? OSPF. What else? The process ID, which we just created. And now we specify the area, which is area 0. Now we do the other two interfaces, the all zeros. IPv6 OSPF 10, area 0. And IPv6 OSPF 10, area 0 as well. And now we see that a neighborship has come alive. the adjacency has been formed with the all-ones router, which is router 1 using interface serial 000, which is good, all right? That means this is working fine. Now we just need to go to router 3 and configure router 3 as well. Same process applies here, so I'm going to do it quicker. First thing, activate unicast routing. Next, IPv6 router OSPF10, router ID all threes. And now we can assign the interfaces. Which interfaces? Do show IPv6, interface brief, all those interfaces that have IP addresses configured, IPv6 addresses. We start with gig 00, IPv6 OSPF10, area 0, interface all zeros, serial, IPv6 OSPF10, area 0, and the interface IPv6 OSPF10, area 0. And now we have two new adjacencies from router 3, including the one to router 1 and the one to router 2. Two adjacencies have been formed. We're pretty much done. All right. Cool. Are we good? Now let's check what happened here. So I'm going to go back to router 1. And we are going to display the IPv6 routing table. And what is different in this IPv6 routing table? We have just learned about two networks here at the top and one more network here, okay, using OSPF. There is one very interesting thing about OSPF version 3 you guys need to remember, and that is that Ospf V3 adjacencies, they are formed based on the linked local addresses. And that's why it says here that it's via FE80 and FE83, because these are linked local addresses. So we need to have linked local addresses to make sure OSPF version 3 functions properly. All right. For all the routes learned via Ospf V3, they are learned as linked local addresses. Now, once again, what is this? It's the administrative distance of OSPF version 3, which happens to be the same as OSPF version 2. So no difference here. Alrighty. Cool. Now we can also show the neighbors. IPv6 OSPF neighbors. And there you go. We have two neighbors connected to router 1, the O2s and the O3s. That means router 2 and router 3. And they are in full state, which just basically means they have converged. They have already exchanged the routes with themselves. Okay, cool. We are done.